medical school or faculty of health sciences, not only in South Africa, but around the world. And the importance of nutrition has been overlooked until recently. So that's one of the reasons, and we're hoping many health professionals are joining, and in particular, health professional students, so that they can learn the vital importance of nutrition and carry it right throughout their career. I'd like to now take the opportunity to introduce our panel. And we've got Dr. Yasin Singh. He is a general practitioner in Cape Town, and he practices plant-based medicine. We've got Jessica Kotolowicz. She's a dietitian, and she also practices plant-based dietetics, also based in the Cape. And we've got Dr. Nicholas Oppenreider, who's based in Germany, who joins us from Germany. He leads PAN International, the Physicians Association in Nutrition. And you might ask, why now? Why are physicians waking up to nutrition now? And it's only in the last few years that physicians have realized the importance of culinary medicine in particularly the management of non-communicable and chronic diseases. I better introduce myself. I'm a public health medical specialist. My job really is from the bedside or the patient to look up from the patient and see from whence that patient has come and what influences their health and what can be modified to improve the health and well-being of that person or that community. Now, we can be thankful to COVID for a lot of things. We wouldn't be talking now if it wasn't for COVID in this form, but it's made the whole world realize that it's sick. And South Africa, as well as part of the world, is also sick. Not only sick in terms of the environment and the climate change aspects, but also as a species. We have, in the last 30, 40 years, and we are experiencing an epidemic of non-communicable diseases. And there's lots of data to support that fact here in South Africa. Stats South Africa in 2014 indicated that diabetes, for example, was one of the leading causes of death. In 2015, it said 68% of South African women are either overweight or obese. And COVID has highlighted it because those people with those concomitant illnesses have the worst morbidity and mortality outcomes of all. And I'd like to include obesity in that. And hopefully during the course of the webinar, you'll understand the pivotal role that nutrition plays in this process. There's a prospective urban and rural epidemiological study which has been going on in South Africa for the last 15 years, known as PURE. It confirms that there's an increased prevalence of uncontrolled non-communicable diseases at community level. And last year at the AfriHealth Symposium, and that's a gathering of health professional educators from all the medical schools and universities across Africa, they have concluded that non-communicable diseases eclipse communicable diseases in Africa. Now, that's some information to chew on as what we think of as Africa and the continent that is one that's plagued by communicable diseases. Now, to understand why nutrition is important, there are a couple of concepts which need to be understood. And in the time constraints, all our presenters are only going to have about 10 minutes and time for questions. So this is going to serve as an introductory webinar, and hopefully it'll stimulate you and give you food for thought in exploring the field, the wonderfully complex field of nutrition. And finally, in the field of introductions, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng. She is the Special Rapporteur to the United Nations Committee on Human Rights, dealing with physical and mental health. She was hoping to be present with us. She's got a very pressing United Nations-wide global mandate. So if she joins us, that's wonderful. She's really interested to hear the importance of nutrition in that delivery of a mandate and how it can assist her and how she can network. So Tlaleng, if you're with us, you're very welcome. Now, some concepts to understand is that of the microbiome. It's a field of science which is relatively new and absolutely essential to understanding that of nutrition. What is the microbiome? It is the sum total of all the microorganisms that everything carries on them. Every animal has them on them and in them. And in particular, I'll be talking about the microbiome in the gut. Now, what is fascinating and why we can't just think, oh, this is interesting. The microbiome, the total cellular mass and genomic mass comprises 90% of all humans. So human cells only comprise 10% in number in that construction. And I think that is a really humbling thought, that we're mainly microbiome and a little bit human. So surely it's important that microbiome is part of us and is important. And why I'm saying that is, as long ago as 2012, they showed that a decrease in gut diversity could predict what sort of cancer that person would acquire. The integrity of the microbiome is vital, that it has the maximum diversity of organisms. And I'll mention the word diversity again, because the more diverse your microbiome, the healthier your gut lining is. And the gut lining is extremely thin. It's 1 cell thick, and it's covered by a thin layer of mucus that protects it. And if your biodiversity of your microbiome is reduced, it opens up that membrane to entry of not only infectious diseases, but a lot of inflammation and autoimmunity. You're going to hear from Dr. Singh later how important that is in your health. And the only way you can maintain that microbiome with its diversity is to feed it, because it's shown that within one meal, your microbiome changes according to what it's fed. And it's part of you. It even expects you to sleep and rest. So if you are stressed and you're not resting your microbiome, you're putting yourself on additional stress. So microbiome requires real food to be as diverse and as protective as possible. And Jessica is going to help us understand what is best for that. The second important concept is that of zoonosis. What is a zoonosis? It's what happens when a microorganism moves from a non-human to a human and causes a disease. Dr. Rebecca Shaw of the World Wildlife Foundation, in her presentation earlier during COVID, said that zoonotic diseases have increased in the last 30 years by over 60 to 70%. Now, what are some of these zoonoses? Let me just remind you. I think you've heard of Zika. You've heard of avian flu, the H5N1. You've heard of MERS. You've heard of SARS. You've heard of Ebola. Oh yeah, HIV. It's also another zoonosis. And now we've got COVID, is another zoonosis. And she describes the reason for this increase is in the way human beings interact with animals. So you can imagine if our interaction with animals is not correct, it's not natural and protective, we open ourselves to these zoonotic diseases. And we've been open to them for the last 10,000 years. As when we first tilled the soil and opened the soil, we became exposed to ancient diseases such as TB, etc., which was also a zoonosis, by the way. Now, the reason for this is the massive industrialization of agriculture, which includes monocultures, which decreases diversity, and it includes the massive use of chemical fertilizers and biocides to maintain these monoculture crops, which also kills all the microorganisms in the soil. Another reduction in biodiversity. So you can see how the environment of the microbiome and our health is related, and its diversity is important. And if the diversity of our environment is compromised, it's reflected in us. So we are sick, and the world is sick. So the question is, and hopefully we'll get some pointers during the course of this morning, is can we feed the planet without destroying it and destroying ourselves? Other civilizations have failed, and they have failed because they've exhausted the soil around them. And if your soil is not alive, there's a lot of evidence to show that healthy soil provides healthy plants, which provides healthy nutrients for healthy populations. And the converse is equally true. And other civilizations, the Roman, Aztec, all of them have succumbed as their depletion of their food source has resulted in their demise. And this is where we're finding ourselves now, today. COVID is merely a symptom of the demise of the health of ourselves and the planet. And COVID has reminded us that it's really important to pay attention. Can we feed the planet without destroying it? Yes, we can. And the solutions are surprisingly simple. If you remember earlier, when I mentioned the high prevalence of non-communicable diseases, Dennis Burkett, who worked in Uganda in plus or minus the 60s, never saw any non-communicable diseases, or never, hardly ever, ever, ever. And that was in a population following the traditional African diet. As with colonization and all that it brought, it was thought that the colonial, traditional American diet, for example now, is the diet of affluence, and that's what makes you believe that you've made it. What can we do to keep our health? If you eat correctly, and that's not high tech, if you farm in a regenerative way that doesn't destroy the biodiversity, and there are many regenerative examples of agriculture, both in urban and in which are showing a tremendous freedom of farmers away from the corporate control of banking institutions and an agricultural industry, which keeps them continually in debt, and it frees them to live a healthier life. Now, the last point I'd like to make is, and it's important, that we heal faster than we harm, apart from acute traumatic illness when we have a car crash or break our leg. And if we allow our bodies to heal and restore the biodiversity of the biome, we can reduce and even reverse and even cure many non-communicable diseases. And doing so, we can understand that the food source giving rise to this change also must impact the environment. COVID has democratized healthcare in a huge way. Never before has civilization engaged in health matters so dynamically as it has now. With that democratization of health, this knowledge of nutrition will drive the changes by consumer behavior, which will cause the industry to change gears, and it already has done so. If you look at the plant-based foods available in our supermarkets today, as opposed to 5 years ago, they're all over. And that is just because of consumer demand. And now if we augment it and support it by health professional knowledge on the importance of nutrition, and realize that it's in the food, the solution for our own and the post-COVID world is largely in the food. There are other very important aspects, but we're focusing on nutrition today. And the democratization that I spoke about comes from returning to traditional, healthy, predominantly plant-based diets. And that you can do democratically 3 times a day. You can vote what you put on your plate for what health you want and what world you want. So that's the power that I'd like patients to take to the consumer market, that daily expression of their democratic right to demand their own health and the planet health. So in saying that, our panelists will each give a short presentation. I've overstepped my welcome by a small amount because I had to do an introduction as well and set everyone up. So it's Dr. Singh. You can get your screen ready. And while I'm saying that, during the course of the presentations, we're going to use this opportunity to launch PAN South Africa during their classes presentation. So over to you, Justine.
Thank you, Andrew. I do have a couple of slides to share with our attendees. And firstly, thank you very much for sharing this time with us on a busy Thursday morning. I hope that what we have to share with you will be very helpful and inspiring. So let me do a share screen. And okay, here we go. So as Andrew's mentioned, today we're talking about nutrition as a therapeutic intervention in the post-COVID world. It's a very snazzy title, but basically my part of this talk is going to be discussing why plant-based nutrition particularly is an effective and powerful tool that a therapist or a practitioner can use in helping patients either recover faster from the contraction of a COVID virus or any other viral infection, or maintain a health status that allows them to contract the virus and have a very light-footed infection versus quite a serious or a severe infection. So what is it that allows plant-based nutrition to help modify and modulate a viral-based infection within the body? So I'm going to touch on a couple of points that Andrew has mentioned already. So firstly, just to summarize, repeat again the focus on zoonotic diseases and the history of zoonotic diseases in the human population. So very simply, they're basically diseases that swap from animal hosts to human hosts based on a particular pathogen. And today we're talking about viral pathogens. Currently, 61% of identified human pathogens are zoonotic in origin. And we have I've listed 3 very big historical examples. The Spanish flu, for example, was avian in origin in the early 20th century, killed 1/3 of the human population. It was one of the first global epidemics that spread around the world because of air travel that had just taken off then. Food-based examples, which are the major zoonotic diseases that we have experienced in the last 20 years. Examples include mad cow disease in the 1980s, H5N1 bird flu that came out of Hong Kong in 1997, and swine flu that came out of pigs in 2009. So why am I focusing on food-based examples of disease? COVID, for example, HIV, for example, that Andrew spoke about, are instances where populations have gone into the animal kingdom, either through agriculture, farmed animals like chickens, or into the wild animal populations, such as chimpanzees in Central Africa, and in search for a source of food, have engaged with not just the animal, but the bugs and the microbes that live on the animal. And so it is this interaction between humans searching for food that has opened up the human population to all of these zoonotic diseases that will, most epidemiologists agree, become the largest risk to, or one of the largest risks to human survival on the planet today. And so this is a pandemic, this is the likelihood of future pandemics from flu-type viruses is increasing all the time because of increased global travel, increased urbanization, changes in land use where people are chopping down rainforests to farm cattle, to farm soy, to farm maize. And when they chop down these virgin forests, they expose themselves to all of these wonderful organisms that have laid hidden and quiet in these untouched lands for so many centuries. So it's the exploitation of natural resources in an unsustainable way that increases our human risk to contracting zoonotic diseases. And as most of us know, this is not a trend that's going to change very quickly or very soon. We have this climate change bubble that's about to land or pop, but I think that the political will and the societal will to change our interaction with the environment is a very slow transitioning process. So for the foreseeable future, we are going to be experiencing a lot more viral epidemics and viral pandemics like COVID. COVID is just the tip of the iceberg, and I think that it's a training ground for human society to understand what is the role of isolation and quarantine, what is the role of vaccination, and more importantly, what is the role of individual choice? How do I live my life, create a health-sustaining immune system that allows me to either avoid infection, or if I do contract an infection, reduce the severity and reduce the duration of this infection in my body. So this is a quick slide, and I'll explain this when I come to inflammation later on, but this is a slide that looks at the association between, or the intersection between communicable and non-communicable diseases. I apologize if the part of the slide is blocked off by the presenter faces, but basically what I want you to understand is that the key underlying communication language in an acute infection is inflammation. The production of inflammatory cytokines, a cytokine storm that then leads on to different inflammatory pathways, different immune system cells being activated. And the switch from an acute inflammatory process to a chronic inflammatory process is very quick and very easy because chronic inflammatory processes use the same inflammatory chemical messages, the same inflammatory cytokines. So if somebody has a low-grade burning production, a low-grade production of inflammatory cytokines from obesity or from a cardiac stent, that they've already got a slow but steady production of these inflammatory cytokines in their body, then here comes this opportunistic infection that creates this massive inflammatory storm. And so in an ideal scenario, the immune system would go through the storm, come down and clear out the bank. You know, the balance would come down to zero. But when you've got this little leak, this slow leak in a tire that's slowly allowing more and more inflammatory cytokines to be produced from our adipose tissue, or from poorly controlled diabetes, or from poorly controlled hypertension, then the body gets a little confused and we find this long-term, lifetime-based inflammatory process take place. And so what we find in the relationship between TB and chronic diseases such as diabetes and hypertension is that they are interchanging and intersecting in both directions. The contraction of TB will make lifetime-based diseases more severe and worse, and the presence of a predisposing condition that is a non-communicable disease will make the infection rate and the severity of a TB infection worse. And so the same can be applied to other communicable diseases such as HIV and COVID. So this point around inflammation being the point of connection, inflammation being the point of transference from an acute communicable disease and a chronic non-communicable disease is something that we need to pay attention to, because we live in a Western or a modern society that does not support low levels of inflammation. Our lifestyle supports elevated levels of inflammation. through our stress levels, through our avoidance or separation from the natural world, through the types of foods that are affordable and accessible to our general population. You know, society, economics, capitalism does not support, from our experience, healthy, information suppressive or information clearing lifestyles. And so this is something that we have to actively participate in, we have to actively make change in, so that the world around us reflects our intention. So these are two studies, and there are a couple of studies coming up, just little excerpts from them. All of the references are present on the slide, so you are very welcome to go and read them explore them further yourself. But the first study that I list here just exemplifies or builds on this idea that the presence of non-communicable diseases, particularly in the COVID diagnosis, makes the likelihood of contraction and severe outcomes worse. So people end up in ICUs, end up on ventilation, end up with more severe side effects and more severe mobility risk profiles because of the predisposing conditions that load them with these levels of inflammation. Complex chronic diseases such as obesity and hypertension increase the severity of COVID-19 infections. And vice versa. Remember that TB graph, the presence of these NCDs will make your COVID infection rate worse, and the presence of COVID will increase your risk for contracting or developing chronic diseases. So if you've got a genetic predisposition, you've got a family history of diabetes type 2, the presence of COVID may open up those genetic codes and make it easier for you to express that gene into a phenotype. But just as inflammation is the common denominator and the link between NCDs and communicable diseases, so too is it an opportunity for healing intervention. Because inflammation is a very simple process. It's just used by the body in very complex ways, but at its heart, it's a very simple process. If you're not familiar, what happens is the body has an infraction or an invasive molecule that comes in, and it mounts an immune response to try and keep you safe, to try and minimize the long-term risk to survival. So it does so through a multitude of ways, and some of them include increasing sympathetic activity, increasing oxidative stress, creating these chemicals like nuclear factor kappa B that go out and identify and destroy these molecules that are seen as invasive, seen as harmful to the body. And so we also know that these processes, oxidative stress, NF kappa B activation, are moderated or affected by the types of foods and the types of food-based nutrients or food-based nutraceuticals that we are exposed to. There's a lot of knowledge in historical medicine. So Ayurvedic medicine or traditional Chinese medicine have historically used food as a medical intervention. And the Greeks said, "You let food be thy medicine." So the idea of food being a healing intervention is not a new one. It's just that our Western science-dominated perspective has lost contact with that. But what we find now with research is that researchers are going back and looking at why does Ayurvedic medicine place such a strong emphasis on turmeric? Why does traditional Chinese medicine place such a strong emphasis on green tea? And by researching these food-based interventions, they come out with these wonderful nutraceuticals like curcumin or green tea catechins that do have an impact on oxidative stress, that do have an impact on sympathetic activity, they do have an impact on cytokine production levels. And so fruits and vegetables and whole grains are the main means, I feel like our general population should be upskilled, should be educated to take control of and manage their diets and manage their health status going forward, because they do three very simple things. They help us to balance inflammation, so reduce the total inflammation load. They help us to manage oxidative stress, that cytokine storm that's created through a viral infection or created through the presence of an NCD. And as Andrew mentioned, they help us to balance and heal and regenerate our healthy gut microbiome. So lots of studies that show the relationship between poor diet, and I'm sure you're very familiar with what constitutes a poor diet. And Jess may go into a bit further, but things such as soft drinks, refined grains, processed meats, all have associations with higher levels of inflammatory cytokine production within the body, whereas plant-based foods have associations with lower levels of inflammatory cytokine levels in the body. So beyond this association between just the presence of the food and the presence or the concentration of inflammation, we also find that there are plant-based foods that actively go and reduce inflammation, such as the curcumin and turmeric extract. So plant-based foods help us to firstly avoid the increase or the creation of inflammation in our body, and secondly help us to empty out the inflammation that we have already built up through the presence of a chronic disease or through the presence of a communicable disease. So plant-based foods are a wonderful tool, they're an effective tool, they're a powerful tool that can be used as a therapeutic intervention to manage inflammation actively. Secondly, plant-based foods are the only source of antioxidants that we have access to. Very small, almost negligible concentrations of antioxidants in some animal-based food products, but the majority of, when you research food sources of antioxidants online, you will see most of those lists will start with spices and herbs, nuts, vegetables and fruit, and maybe chocolate or cacao. So those are a strong, high concentration antioxidant containing foods. And the reason why we focus on antioxidants is because they are able to go into our mitochondria and support the gobbling up or the removing of these free oxygen species, these oxidative stress molecules that are then moving through the body and causing further inflammation, causing cellular and DNA-based destruction and creating long-term disease. So we want to maximize antioxidant-rich foods, and we want to minimize either antioxidant-free foods or foods that produce free radicals. So these would be your processed oils, your meats, your poultries, your eggs, your seafood and fish. As I said, the references are all on the slides for you to go ahead and look up on. Plant-based foods, as Andrew spoke about, are one of the main ways, in my opinion, one of the main ways that we can support a healthy microbe in our digestive system. The majority of immune system activity takes place in the gut because it's constantly vetting the food that's coming in. It's constantly interacting with the microbes in our gut. These organisms, these probiotics, take in fiber from our diet and live their lives and produce what they call a waste product, but what we call a wonderful nutrient that we absorb and integrate into our immune system. So our immune systems are dependent on the presence of beneficial bacteria, on the presence of beneficial microbes in our digestive tract. We are reliant on their waste products. And so there's this harmonious relationship between us where we give them fiber and they give us life-giving nutrients. And so this relationship between probiotics or microbes and the human health is essential to survive the post-COVID world. And microbes need fiber from fruits and vegetables. Microbes need other nutrients, other antioxidants from fruits and vegetables. So we need a healthy plant-based diet in order to have a healthy microbial system. And this is a really cool Harvard study that says that foods that fight inflammation are plant-based. There's no question about it. There's no debating about it. Yes, we may have cultural habits, or we may have societal habits, or we may have emotional dependencies or familial habits around food relationships and the purpose of food in our body. But when we come down to science, when we come down to the nuts and bolts of which foods give us health and which foods give us disease, there's no question that plant-based nutrition is the way to go. So how do we integrate plant-based nutrition into a healthy lifestyle? How do we make it easily accessible to our patients, to ourselves? I will pass over to Jess Kotlowitz, who has lots of experience in creating workable and livable nutrition plans for patients. Thank you.
Thanks, Eugene.
Thanks. While Jessica's getting a screen share, just to emphasize one or two points, how important a microbiome. Think of how a baby is born as it comes through the birth canal, and its face and nose and eyes and mouth and ears are vaccinated, inoculated with the gift of its mother's microbiome. And modern obstetrics recreates that inoculation at cesarean section by taking samples of the maternal perineum and inoculating the baby when they do cesarean sections, for example, where the baby is not exposed to that microbiome. And also the important thing of fiber and diversity. Each plant's fiber is different. Think of that. And each fiber requires a different bacteria to effectively digest it. And in that comes the diversity, which is important. So, and that relationship occurs once you eat correctly or incorrectly, either way. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so I thought I would give a little bit more practical information on a plant-based diet and how a plant-based diet helps to prevent chronic diseases of lifestyle. So Prof. Robinson did touch on this a little bit, but I thought I would just go into the nutrition transition in South Africa, which is basically the reason behind why we have such high rates of chronic diseases of lifestyle in South Africa. And the nutrition transition is basically characterized by changes in dietary patterns of individuals or groups of people or whole population. And it's usually accompanied by an epidemiological transition from a high prevalence of infectious diseases to a high prevalence of nutrition-related chronic diseases of lifestyle, which is what we're seeing at the moment. And this is usually caused by urbanization, modernization, and acculturation, which leads to people eating a more westernized diet. So there are actually 5 stages of the nutrition transition, and the first, and within a population, different individuals or different groups of people can be at different stages. So the first stage is hunter-gatherer, which is where people eat a diet high in carbohydrates and fiber and low in fat. Then the next stage is famine, which is when people start to shift towards a more agricultural lifestyle. And in this phase, there's more food scarcity, less dietary variety. And then the next phase is receding famine. That's when farming starts to develop further and people start to eat more fruits and vegetables and more animal protein and start to decrease their consumption of starchy staples. The fourth stage is where we're kind of at now in most of South Africa, which is the nutrition-related chronic diseases of lifestyle, which is where people eat a mostly Western diet, which is high in ultra-processed, energy-dense foods, high in fats, cholesterol, and refined carbohydrates. And then the fifth stage, which is what we're aiming to get to, is behavioral change, which is when people start to follow healthy dietary guidelines or patterns based on scientific knowledge. So this is just a graph to show you the change in energy consumption in South Africa between the 1960s and 2001. And you can see that calorie intake increased significantly. Calories from fat increased quite significantly. Calories from protein increased a little bit, and calories from carbohydrates. So basically, most of our macronutrients and our calories in general increased. So basically, with urbanization and modernization, we find that there's an increase in total and saturated fat intake, refined carbohydrates, added sugar, and total and animal-derived protein. And at the same time, there's a decreased consumption of carbohydrates, plant protein, and fiber. And usually recommended micronutrient intakes are not met at the same time. So the end result is a Western diet, which is usually high in fat, high in saturated fat, high in salt, low in dietary fiber and phytochemicals, and also a scenario where energy intake exceeds energy needs, which leads to overweight and obesity in the population. So this was a study done in Cape Town in 1996, and it shows that the longer people spent in an urbanized environment, the more their diet and their macronutrient intake changed. So you can see that carbohydrate intake went from 68% of energy to 58%, so carbohydrate intake decreased. Fat intake increased from 23% to 30%. Protein intake stayed around about the same, but there was a shift from eating more plant-based proteins to eating more animal-based proteins. And what's not shown on the graph is that fiber intake also decreased over time. So average fiber intake went from 20 grams a day to about 16 grams a day. So I thought I would just also mention the double burden of disease, which is something we have here in South Africa, which is when countries undergo rapid urbanization and then there's a rapid nutrition transition, which means that certain parts of the population are still battling with undernutrition and infectious diseases, and other parts of the population are having high rates of chronic diseases of lifestyle, which leaves us with this double burden of disease. And actually in South Africa, we have a triple burden of disease because we also have the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So there's a lot to tackle. So these are the top 17 risk factors for death in South Africa. And you can see that a lot of them are directly related to the nutrition transition. So things like high blood pressure, high BMI, high cholesterol, diabetes, physical inactivity, low fruit and veg intake, vitamin A deficiency, iron deficiency. These are all factors that can be hopefully resolved with behavior change. Okay, so like the goal for the future is to get to that stage 5 of the nutrition transition, which is behavior change, which is when people start to eat a healthy diet based on dietary guidelines. And we usually have these food-based dietary guidelines, which their role is to promote a healthy, balanced diet and to decrease risk of chronic diseases of lifestyle within a population. So in South Africa, our latest food-based dietary guidelines were released in 2013. And basically these guidelines replaced the old nutrient-based recommendations. So the old recommendations used to say things like that, like try to keep your intake of saturated fat below 10%. And obviously the general population doesn't understand what that means. It's not very practical. So the new way of doing things is to put things into food terms for people and to give practical, short, positive, science-based messages. And the dietary guidelines in South Africa they do promote a predominantly plant-based diet, but also a diet that is traditional and affordable. And they do suggest limits on animal products and animal protein intake. So these are the 11 guidelines, the 11 South African dietary guidelines. And you can see there's an emphasis on making starchy foods part of most meals. If you read the extended guidelines, they do state that those starchy foods should be as unprocessed as possible, and they should be traditional indigenous starchy foods. And then there's an emphasis on dry beans, split peas, lentils, and soy as a source of protein and micronutrients, and plenty of fruits and vegetables, obviously. There is some limits placed on eating meat and red meat and eggs because too much of these foods do increase risk of chronic diseases of lifestyle. And then you'll see there's limits on things like sugar and salt. And in terms of fats, there's a dietary guideline which says choose vegetable oils rather than hard fats. And that's basically a practical way of guiding people to choose unsaturated fats over saturated fats. So I thought for those of you who don't know, now that we've seen that the dietary guidelines are promoting a plant-based diet, I would just give you a little bit of a summary of the evidence on why a plant-based diet is so beneficial and how it can decrease risk of chronic diseases of lifestyle in a population. So basically, plants are the only foods that have phytochemicals and the only foods that have fiber in them. So phytochemicals, we know, reduces the risk of heart disease, cancer, and other diseases. We know that fiber lowers the risk of cancer, heart disease, and obesity. And we also know that plant-based eaters are the only group of people in the population that actually meet their daily fiber requirements. Plant foods have no cholesterol. They're generally low in saturated fat, and they're great sources of certain nutrients like folate, potassium, vitamin C, and vitamin E. In terms of heart disease, we found that risk of dying from cardiovascular disease is 24% lower in vegetarians. We know that vegetarians have lower cholesterol than meat eaters, and vegans have even lower cholesterol than vegetarians. And we know that vegans have low LDL cholesterol, low blood triglycerides, and also better LDL to HDL ratios. in terms of hypertension, which is one of our biggest killers in South Africa, we know that vegetarians have lower blood pressure than meat eaters and also have lower risk of hypertension. And all in all, meat eaters are 2.5 times more likely to have hypertension than vegans. And we know for sure that diets high in fruits and vegetables help to lower blood pressure. In terms of weight, so what this graph is showing is that vegans have the lowest BMI out of the total population. And as consumption of animal products decreases, BMI tends to decrease. And vegans are actually the only portion of the population that are in a normal BMI category. In terms of cancer, some studies do show that there are lower rates of cancer amongst vegetarians. We also know, as Yashin said, vegetarians have better colon ecology and more protection against colon cancer. And we know that the antioxidants in fruits and veg help to lower risk of cancer. And then we know that certain animal products like red and processed meat and dairy can increase risk of certain types of cancer. And then lastly, vegans have 50% reduced risk of diabetes, less risk of renal and gallstones, 50% reduced risk of diverticular disease and other gut issues, and also are less likely to develop dementia. So there's plenty of evidence to back up why we are recommending a plant-based diet for the general population to decrease chronic diseases of lifestyle. And I know some of you might have some questions about whether a plant-based diet is adequate and whether we can really meet all nutrient needs using a plant-based diet. So I just wanted to share this position statement from the ADA, which is an evidence-based statement from 2016. And they found that appropriately planned vegetarian, including vegan diets are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits in the prevention and treatment of certain diseases. And they also concluded that these diets are appropriate for all stages of the life cycle, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence, older adulthood, and athletes. So for those of you wondering what we should be eating on a plant-based diet, I thought I would just give you a brief overview, and we can always chat about this more in the Q&A. But these are the plant-based food groups that I generally educate people on. So fruits, vegetables, starches, legumes and soy products, nuts and seeds, and then oils and fats. And when I first started working in plant-based nutrition about 6 years ago, I made this little plate model. I was really struggling to find educational resources to use to help patients understand how to balance their diet on a plant-based diet and how to balance their meals. And I've always liked a plate-based model because it's really practical. It's easy for people to understand what to put on their plate at each meal and in what ratios. And it helps to ensure macro and micronutrient intake. So this is basically what I still use today to help educate my patients. But I always suggest that about half their plate or half their diet is made up of fruits and or vegetables. And about a quarter would then also be whole grains or starches, preferably unprocessed starchy foods. A quarter would be high protein plant foods like legumes or soy products. And then I do encourage patients to add as a condiment a little bit of plant fats to their meals, because most of your other plant-based food groups are almost fat-free, and the adding plant fats just helps to ensure intake of fat-soluble vitamins and obviously your fatty acids, essential fatty acids. So that's my general guidelines that I give to people. Subsequently to this, I came across the vegan plate, which was designed by dietitians in the US. And you can see the division of food groups is very similar to my plate. But what I really like about this one is that it focuses on certain micronutrients like calcium. So it gives a breakdown of which foods within each food group would be high in calcium that people should focus on to get enough calcium. And then it also gives some other essential nutrients that might not be included on the plate that people might need to use supplements for, or go in the sun for, or eat iodinated salt for, those sorts of things. So that's a great resource too. And this one I really like too. This is Canada's new food guide. So it's like their equivalent of our food-based dietary guidelines. This was released in 2019, I believe. And basically you can see the ratios of different foods or different food groups are similar to the previous two plates. And you can see that they're also promoting a predominantly plant-based diet. Even within the protein section of the plate, there are mostly beans and legumes and tofu there. And they've also decided to advise people to make water their drink of choice as opposed to milk, which was what was previously recommended. So yeah, that's just some general guidelines for how we would balance a plant-based diet and how easy and simple and affordable it can be for people. Yeah, so I'm going to pass on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. I think that is really practical and helping people to move towards this. And one of the reasons why we recognize that this webinar is so important is because at this stage, we don't have any treatment for COVID. We don't have any vaccine to prevent COVID. The only way people can protect themselves from this pandemic to the best of their ability, obviously with the physical distancing, mask and hand washing, is to make sure that you keep your microbiome happy and healthy. So you're learning about that. And so your immune system is as healthy as possible, and you have as few chronic diseases as humanly possible. Now we're coming to a milestone event, and Dr. Nicholas is going to share with us what the Physicians Association of Nutrition is all about. And in doing so, I'll give him the honor of launching the South African chapter of PAN, and also with the participants who've got an interest in PAN and learning more about it. There will be opportunities to get on board. It's definitely an inclusive process, which I think is going to get quite a bit of momentum as we move forward. Nicholas, over to you.
Thank you very much.
What a privilege it is to have you here and to have this opportunity as PAN South Africa. Without you, we also might not have been here today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for having me on this great panel, and thanks to you, everyone. I'm very excited to be here with you together online, and yeah, excited for PAN South Africa. So I won't add any science or practical solutions. We heard about that. I would want to introduce you quickly to what the Physicians Association for Nutrition is doing and plans to do, and will hopefully be able to support PAN South Africa with around these problems and solutions that we just heard of. And the umbrella for our activities is mainly getting public health into medical practice and getting health practitioners to supporting public health measurements. And I hope the quick presentation will explain what I mean by that. So very short history. Physicians Association for Nutrition was established 2018, so just 2.5 years ago in Germany as a nonprofit health organization, and since then has expanded to an international network of by now 6 established nonprofit health organizations under the name of PAN in other countries. And we are some more offices are about to launch, and we are in cooperation with many more organizations and groups who would like to join the network. But I will tell you a bit more about that at the end of the presentation. The goals of PAN are, number 1, make whole food plant-based nutrition a key part of healthcare on all the levels. So it's including medical education, medical practice, hospitals, and healthcare system. And number two, and even more importantly, in my opinion, is to engage health professionals in efforts around sustainable and health and food policies. So this is definitely the greatest tool to shape healthy societies, creating just and healthy food environments. And we as health professionals are a highly respected group in society with a lot of lobby power, which is oftentimes not used, unfortunately, at all for public health topics. And we would like to change that on the area of nutrition. Why are we doing this? What are the reasons and arguments we work with? You heard a lot of, about them already, so I go through there quite quickly. We know that poor diet causes more deaths than any other risk factor globally, which is just the dietary risks without malnutrition, which you see on the list as, I think, number 8 as well. So it's just a poor diet in terms of low consumption of fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, high consumption of processed foods and animal products. So this is 80% of our work, the link between nutrition and chronic diseases. But we do include more and more other planetary and public health factors, like for sure the link between nutrition and climate change. We all know at least 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the animal agriculture sector. While this is not the largest part or the largest parameter in this climate change equation, we won't meet our climate goals without a huge transformation of our food systems, including the transition to way more plant-based foods. Another thing that we heard about shortly is our antimicrobial resistances. We know the 2 main ways. One is our healthcare system itself. The other main way of emerging antibiotic resistances is animal agriculture, while 70% of all antibiotics are currently consumed by animals worldwide and not by humans. And a third public health topic is definitely the increasing risk of zoonotic pandemics, which we heard about already. So I just add that graphic from the UN Environment Program, which I like a lot, and where we can see that intensified agriculture, livestock production, antimicrobial resistance, and climate change, which we all kind of touched now very briefly, are some of the most important factors in increasing zoonotic diseases and respective pandemics. So this is all part of our work. How do we do this? What do we do? We follow the channel of educate, empower, and engage, and we work with health professionals, more specifically medical students and medical doctors within this channel, which I like to explain. So education, kind of a no-brainer. Of course, we do have our educational formats for health professionals. There is a website with the respective resources. We've got different lecture series for now, one in German, one in English. The current one in English is called Nutrition Greater Medicine and is a series of monthly webinars with international experts on their various topics. We are hosting the VegMed conference together with the Charité University in Berlin, which is the Europe's largest conference on plant-based nutrition in medicine. The 7th edition of VegMed conference in Berlin 2020 was postponed due to obvious reasons until spring 2021 and will be held as a complete digital conference. So, and as we are, I think, in the same, or depending on the time of the year, very close time zones, you are, of course, all very heartily invited to join us in these 3 days experts-only conference. I would like to give a bit more info on the pan-university groups, because I think that is an example of this channel that I described. So we started the Pan Academy, which is just a set of seminars or webinars right now that we give to medical students. And we started that in 2019, visiting the single medical schools in Germany. And through these seminars, we were able to identify a lot of committed and highly motivated medical students who then started university groups at their campuses and they're now, within just 1 year, there were 15 university groups founded out of the 40 medical schools that we have in Germany. And they're now empowering themselves with journal clubs, cooking events, events at their medical schools, campaigns to implement nutrition as part of their local curriculum. And they're actually, right now, that will start on November 5th, they organized Germany's first ever digital lecture series on nutrition in medicine, which is promoted at all medical schools, accepted as a selective at some of those medical schools, CME accredited, and accompanied by a scientific evaluation of the impact of this series. And they just opened registrations 2 days ago and already received more than 1,000 registrations from medical students and medical doctors in Germany. So I think that is definitely for us, definitely a success story regarding this channel of education, empowerment, and engagement. So I talked about the PAN Academy already. And then there's the online education platform, which we will launch in 2021, right after VegMed has taken place, where we will just consolidate all our materials, lectures, and new courses on nutrition and health on one central platform. So off to empowerment. This working field is there to equip health professionals, especially medical doctors, with the tools to support their patients in dietary change. And to be clear, this is not, we don't want to equip medical doctors to do this work, which we got other people for, like dietitians and nutritionists who were trained to do exactly that. This is not to have medical doctors doing their work, but it is about some basic knowledge about nutrition and as well cooking. It is about knowing how to motivate patients, when to speak about nutrition, and it is about doing some of the work maybe, but as well know whom to refer these patients to, so that they're being supported in the best way. So what we do have there is an online cooking class. We have a patient brochure, which we will expand to a toolkit until VegMed 2021 for medical practices. We are working on an online challenge, which will probably be published late 2021 for patients and lay people. We created hospital food guidelines with a German health insurance to support hospitals in creating more healthy and plant-based menus for their staff and their patients, which will be followed by a respective healthy hospital food campaign with international partners as well in 2021. And we just got a children's program funded, which will start as well in 2021, where we will create resources to specifically support pediatricians and families and young adults. Last but not least, engagement. This is, of course, the hardest part, as it involves a lot of networking and politics and various strategies in each country. So as a young NGO, we are kind of in the first steps where we do a network with a lot of global NGOs, especially in the public health sector and the climate and health movement, which I can say, at least in Europe, is opening a lot of doors currently regarding plant-based nutrition in the healthcare bubble and the healthcare world. There is some work on national levels regarding, for example, in Germany, regarding implementation of nutrition in the medical curriculum. And we hope to be part of the respective processes around dietary guidelines as well. We will launch a campaign on the link between COVID-19 and nutrition in 2021, gathering health professionals from all around the world to speak out about this topic and this link, and to demand respective changes from the public, but even more so from political decision makers and respective institutions. And we just started an international food guidelines campaign together with our friends at nutritionfacts.org and ProVeg to assess all national food guidelines and be able to propose respective changes on the fundament of the current evidence towards more healthy and more sustainable dietary guidelines. And we do all this work as one international network. The part of international synergies was, or this idea was a core idea of PAN right from the start. So the countries that you see in green right now are part of the PAN network. And I am more than happy that we are, or that my dear colleagues and the experts you heard today are about to launch PAN South Africa. As we hope to be able to support PAN South Africa with our experience in the field and to learn a lot as well by translating and adapting the respective programs in a new environment. So thank you very much. And back to Professor Robinson.
Thank you, Niklaus. And I was hoping you'd say, and I hereby declare PAN South Africa duly launched. So over to say that, Niklaus, and then it's done.
All right, and I hereby declare PAN South Africa to be launched.
Perfect. Okay, now that's I can tick that bit in the agenda. Well done. We're now opening the floor to questions, and I'll let our panelists take it on directly as they have been addressed. I see Dr. Yassine has a few questions. I don't know if you want to start, and then all the panelists are welcome to chip in as to round off the question, and I'll try and moderate that process. We've got just over 15 minutes. The webinar is ending at 12:30, and if there are any questions, please direct them to all the links that have been provided to you, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can if we don't handle it now. Yassine?
Thank you. Just to run through the questions very quickly, we have the first one from Ishak Date asking about the evidence of a change in inflammatory profiles when one adopts a plant-based diet. The slides that I presented will be emailed out to participants thereafter, and on the slide there are references for each of the statements made. One of the references that I want to highlight that I have just brought up here is an article called "The Effects of Diet on Inflammation, Emphasis on the Metabolic Syndrome." So my focus on this presentation has been on COVID and communicable diseases. But like I said, the way in which the body initiates inflammation is the same. It's the same process of cytokine production. It's the same process of the cytokine storm. And so when we look at the impact of nutrition on cytokine levels, on inflammation from a metabolic syndrome type picture, we can also extrapolate those results or those findings into a communicable disease perspective. And so that one article, which has been referenced in the slide presentation, is very informative because that's the article that speaks about the relationship between antioxidants and fiber from fruits and vegetables and whole grains, helping to reduce inflammation and boost the immune system actively, and the presence of those alternative foods and lifestyle choices that increase levels of inflammation, the processed fats, the high GI carbohydrates, the animal-based proteins. So the references in the slides are, for me, they are what I would like to see as a snowballing effect, because each article has a bunch of references and each reference has a bunch of references. So if you're interested, there are lots of references there, but if you need particular input, you're welcome to email me. The next question for me was from Makotso Lekoa, asking around particularly the relationship between psychiatric and diseases and neuroinflammation. I must admit that when I was in clinical practice, which I'm not anymore, I did use or did rely on plant-based nutrition interventions very heavily for the treatment of mental health diseases, whether they range from the depression, anxiety end of the spectrum to the more schizophrenia, dementia, Alzheimer's end of the spectrum, because these are processes that rely on changes in the body, on changes in the membranes of neurons, changes in the levels of omega-3s to 6s to 9s, changes in cellular processes, changes in how mitochondria support health or support apoptosis. And all of these physiological processes are modified or intervene or have openings, have gaps for intervention through plant-based nutrients. The body is, if you think about it very simply, we have three simple inputs into the body. It's the food that we eat, the oxygen that we breathe, and the water that we drink. And from those three inputs, all health is created. And from those three inputs, all ill health is created. So we can use those three inputs, particularly the food that we eat, to support healing or to support disease creation. So in the case of psychiatric diseases, high levels of particular omega-3s, high levels of particular amino acids, high levels of particular electrolytes like magnesium, support the healing of those membranes that allow efficient and optimal transfer of electrical stimulus down a neuronal pathway. And lastly, I want to just address a question about the whole Banting movement and the relationship between their philosophy around health and weight loss and lowering blood pressure and plant-based nutrition. I want to first say that the research that Tim Noakes and the Banting movement is founded on speaks primarily of the place of high levels of protein, high levels of healthy protein versus high levels of processed carbohydrates. That's the fundamental change that that research is speaking about. It is then the researcher, the reader's perspective that says, okay, high protein equals high animal protein. Whereas I have very successfully helped patients transition into a ketogenic type diet because of epilepsy type syndrome, and implemented ketogenesis through the use of high plant-based proteins and high plant-based fats. And so for me, ketogenesis is not something that you want to play around with because it is not a sustainable, from my perspective, a sustainable long-term solution for health and wellness. The liver particularly is not fed by ketones, and so you start running through all of your resources very quickly, and you end up in really dangerous positions. But when appropriate, you can very well adopt a ketogenesis diet using clean ingredient plant-based sources. Because when you're using animal-based proteins, in addition to the protein, you're having all of the other junk that comes in with it. The hormones, the animal's fear process, the animal's inflammatory cytokines, the animal's stress-based hormones that then interact with your body and cause disease and imbalance in your body. So you're not just getting protein, you're not just getting amino acids, you're getting a bunch of other stuff. And that's from the best quality grass-fed organic free-range meat. Then there's the chemical residue from processing and the chemical residue from storing in a store for 2 weeks and the acid washing and whatever. So for me, there's no reason to ever rely on an animal-based solution as a nutritional intervention. Now, I hope that answers the questions. If there are further questions, you're welcome to email me, but please do refer to the references in the slide presentation that will be sent out.
Thanks, Yassine. Jessica?
Can I also, I wanted to add to the Tim Noakes question, because the question said that, the Banting diet helps with weight loss and lowering blood pressure. And I just want to make it clear that any diet that puts you into a caloric deficit will usually result in weight loss, and that weight loss is not equivalent to health. So yes, overweight and obesity are one of the risk factors for certain chronic diseases of lifestyle. And often when people do lose significant amounts of weight, they do lower certain metabolic markers like cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, blood pressure. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, inflammatory markers in their body are good. It doesn't necessarily equal to long-term health, and it doesn't necessarily also equal to long-term weight loss, because, and I'm sure a lot of dietitians that are watching will agree with me, we find when people follow an overly restrictive approach to losing weight and a sort of like a fad diet approach where they lower their calories too quickly and they lose weight too quickly, they tend to regain the weight. And a lot of data shows us that most weight loss diets, within 2 years, people will regain the weight. So if you see Timnox's diet as just a weight loss solution, it's probably not a very long-term solution and not a long-term solution for health.
Yeah,
thanks.
If I could quickly add something, because we just we have that topic in our second Pan Academy seminar, which is called Nutrition Basics, and in the end, the whole low carb leads to weight loss thing is exactly like Jessica said, and you can see that in the studies that are out there. There is no study longer than 1 year comparing low fat versus low carb diets, showing that the low carb diets lead to more weight loss. It's quite the opposite. Especially when you look at not just weight loss, which could be any kind of weight, which could be water you lose, et cetera, but if you look at body fat loss, and that is where there might be a short-term benefit of low carb diets, like within a few weeks or months. But if you consider this as a kind of long-term strategy, this is not the way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I saw there were a few more questions about nutrition. Can I just go ahead and?
Please.
Okay. So there was a question from Brucey about GMO plant-based foods in South Africa. And I just wanted to address this because basically people believe that a lot of our crops in South Africa are GMO, but we actually only have 3 GMO crops in South Africa, which is corn, soy, and cotton's not really an edible crop. So in terms of food, we're thinking about corn and soy, and those are staple foods in South Africa, but it is possible to find non-GMO options for those. And it is also possible to eat a plant-based diet that just excludes those foods because there's a lot of variety outside of the GMO spectrum. And then she also asked about that her daughter is allergic to whole fats and what can she give instead. I think that's like an individual medical question, and maybe it's best to discuss that with a dietitian or healthcare provider. But I would doubt that she's allergic to all whole fats, maybe more things like nuts or seeds or certain nuts and seeds. So I'm sure there are certain fats that you could find to put into her diet so that she does get enough essential fatty acids.
Thank you, Jess. There's another question that says, is there conclusive evidence to suggest that vegans, plant-based eaters have a lower risk of dying from COVID-19? There is, but with all medical science and information, there's never conclusive evidence that equates one condition with an outcome. For example, I mentioned tobacco right in the beginning. Some people might have an aunt or an uncle or a granny who's smoked until they were 100 and nothing happened to them. They died fine. But yet everyone understands that smoking tobacco causes cancer and is linked with it. World Health Organization Expert Committee on Cancer has also linked processed red meat as a causes cancer. So that's stated there. And yet polony, which has caused the zoonosis outbreak in South Africa recently, is freely available. And in fact, in the health department I work in, they're served at tea time twice a day. I said, you might as well serve us with cigarettes instead of polony, which got the same cancer risk at tea time. However, the conclusive evidence comes indirectly. Those patients that are obese, those patients that have type 2 diabetes or type 1 or other forms of diabetes, those patients that have hypertension have a higher mortality and morbidity outcomes when infected with COVID. And this data has come from the data that's been collected in the Western Cape tertiary level hospitals. So it's up to date South African latest data that confirms that. So it's associated. There's no we can't get causal links, and nutritional epidemiology doesn't allow for that. I hope that's helpful. Are there any other questions that have?
There was a question about from Janelle. She said that she wants to become vegetarian, but she's fussy with legumes and soy products. And are there any tips? So I have a lot of patients who are vegetarian or vegan and don't particularly like eating beans or legumes. And I think there are a lot of other protein-rich options out there. And what I usually suggest to people is to try foods that are maybe made from beans or legumes that don't resemble the whole bean. So something like a legume-based pasta. So you get pastas made from chickpeas or lentils. You get things like chickpea flour, which you can make wraps and pancakes and things like that from, and baked goods from. Most people enjoy hummus, even if they don't enjoy whole chickpeas. Most people would easily eat something like a split pea soup, where the peas are kind of blended into the food. So there are, there's a lot of options. And then there are also, pea-based protein powders that you can add into smoothies and oats and things like that.
Yeah, just to add, where do our proteins come from? All proteins come from all plants. Every plant has protein. Even an iceberg lettuce has some grams of protein. But it becomes quite onerous. For example, to get your daily nutritional requirement of protein, if you ate, you'd get it if you ate 2 kilograms of broccoli a day. So that's quite tough going. So it's important to realize that all proteins come from plants. No animal can make any protein at all. So I think that's important. And in discovering your protein source, it's a journey. You'll discover which plants provide that and give you the most and help you thrive the most. And it's a journey of learning, because as you heal yourself, your body becomes more receptive to eating a wider range of nutrients, which before, when your gut was inflamed, and that inflammation of the gut caused by the food we get is called dysbiosis, when the cells of the gut lining allow leaky gut syndrome, and one of the fundamental causes of non-communicable disease. As that heals, you become more able to absorb the nutrients that you had difficulty with. And people often talk about carbs, giving them a problem because it's refined carbs. So I'd just like to close. We've got a few minutes if another question comes, and we'll go through again in detail. I'm going to close it at half past. You've seen?
I want to just add a comment, but maybe Niklas also has a comment to add.
No, I just wanted to answer one question, which is more about the how to get engaged with Pan South Africa. But
yes, answer, go, Nick.
All right, okay. So DJ asked, what are the ways that we can get involved in helping to spread this message? It sounds like Pan is for doctors and dietitians. How do everyday people help out? And I don't know what I can just speak for Pan International. Like, if it weren't for volunteers and staff in all types of, with all kinds of different backgrounds, we would never do the work we do. So if you're interested in supporting this, just reach out to Pan South Africa via email, I guess, info@pan-sa.org. Because NGOs, especially young NGOs, definitely need support from people with a great variety of backgrounds.
Thanks, Niklas. And what we're also doing, we're reaching out to the students' bodies. To become a health professional, one is registered with your professional body, and all the students undergoing health professional training, we'll try and network with them to make sure that they can access to this resource. So,
Andrew, I wanted to just add a comment to what you had shared earlier around all proteins coming from plants, and building on what Jess had mentioned earlier around the whole banting process. I think the reason why banting was so successful in South Africa is because people came to banting, which is a high protein diet from a highly refined carbohydrate-based diet. And so that shift to a little bit more protein, a little bit more amino acids in their diet, helped their bodies experience a different level of metabolism, a different level of physiology. And so that process of ensuring that you are maintaining appropriate protein intake through your diet is very important, because it's what helps facilitate the creation of new cells, enzymes, all of the little worker bees that do the business of keeping your body alive. But those amino acids are very easily and cleanly sourced from a multitude of plant-based sources. And as you said, you get protein in all plant-based sources, whether you're talking about a low concentration in iceberg lettuce to a high concentration in a chickpea or a sunflower seed that just mentioned. So the idea that protein is associated with meat is something that our South African mindset has to address, because it is a very deeply ingrained cultural belief system that is not accurate. It is maybe very comfortable because it is the cultures that we come from, it is the families that we are brought up in. But it is certainly not accurate that it is required for health, and it is certainly not accurate that it is essential for surviving the communicable disease and the non-communicable disease waves that are going to be hitting us in the future.
Thank you all so much for your inputs, and to the participants for hanging in there. I see there's still nearly 60, which is incredible. I hope you found this introductory webinar useful, and hopefully it can stimulate your and whet your appetite for the wonderful power that nutrition has in both healing at an individual level and at a planetary level, and the power that it has democratically to enable you to put on your plate for what sort of health you choose and what sort of worlds you'd like to have. So in saying that very briefly, thank you all so much for your presentations and your time. It's really appreciated. It's hoped that the next webinars will carry CPDs. We were so anxious to get this webinar aired to start, because I think now you can understand how vitally important nutrition is in the post-COVID world. I wish you well on your journeys and great health. Thank you very much for joining. Cheers.